So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to speak for 5 or 6 minutes. You can tell us a little bit more about yourself and your relationship to the people in the movie. You can tell us a little bit more about Little Canada and what you remember of it, of what the movie made you think about, what you remembered through the movie. And then we'll have Bob say a few words from an academic perspective. And then we'll open it up and we'll have a discussion and conversation, all of us together. So, somebody wants to go first? Yes. All right. So Paul, please.
I come from a very large family here in Little Canada. I come from a large family here in Little Canada, the Le Tendres, or Le Tenders, the Paquins, or Paquins. Rita Paquin from the documentary is my mom. Bernadette Le Tendre is my maternal grandmother. Other family members in the documentary are my paternal aunt and uncle, Lucienne Paquin and Roland Paquin. Cousins Arthur Paquin also is the older gentleman leading there. The recording was made in my mother's kitchen and dining room. I have no current affiliations or activities in Lowell except that occasionally social interaction with old acquaintances, which I just did today. Old musician, I find him sitting here. I performed at the Lowell Folk Festival twice with my mother. And my brother Guy. I have also been a guest speaker, singer, and dancer at Little Canada's clubs and events. My mother, brother, and myself provided music for a Jack Kerouac play musical a number of years ago also. So that's my connection to Lowell, quickly. I understand and speak French, though my grammar is quite weak. I practice my French daily and currently have a Duolingo streak of almost 300 days, if you know what that is. I have always been proud of my French-Canadian culture. So growing up in Petit Canada was not boring. We were surrounded by a river on 2 sides, a large park on another, and 2 main streets leading into the vibrant center of town, while being traversed by multiple functional canals. As I said, it was not boring. I loved the adventures. Our family was tied to St. Jean the Baptist Church, like everybody in Little Canada, and the affiliated Catholic schools. We were also connected to the mills for employment. I even worked there. It was my first job. My first job at approximately 14 or 15 years old was making boxes in the attic of one of those mills on the 4th floor. I was alone on the floor making boxes all day long. I actually enjoyed the experience. I am very proud to come from Little Canada, and I have so many wonderful memories of our very large extended families and friends in Petit Canada. Thank you very much.
I think I'm too short for this. My name is Suzanne Fréchette, and I too grew up in Little Canada. Paul is actually my cousin. So the people in the video, early on in front of the pastime is the back of the head of my uncle, Henry Fréchette. We didn't get to see him turn around, and then of course my aunt and uncle on my grandmother's side. She was the oldest of 11, and they grew up behind the church, actually on Cheever Street, which is gone now. My mom would tell us stories about the dump that was there, and I remember a cousin died in a bad scenario there. But so we would hear the stories of Little Canada and living there. My dad's family, actually Cody Fréchette, they shortened their name when they came over illegally in 1920s. Came later, obviously. My grandparents and my father's older brother who fought under the name the Blonde Tiger, for those of you who are familiar with fighting, Jean-Paul Fréchette. They came in the 1920s. So they all lived behind the church if you remember from the video, they showed the church and then there was an empty field of boulders. At one point, when I was born, my grandparents and my family lived there. Those were buildings. There were 18 units that were owned by my Pepe, my mother's father, and they had a store, Sawyer's Market. If you ever talk to Rita Mercier in the Lowell City Council, she talks about my Pepe growing up, but that's where we lived when I was born. And then eventually, in 1967, when the demolition started, my grandfather lost those buildings, and he died 2 years later, and I do believe that's what killed him. You get so emotional. What's really tough to watch is to realize how much is gone. Because I remained in Little Canada until after the church closed. I was on the parish council. We fought so hard to keep the church open. We visited the bishop. There was 5 of us. It was Arthur Eno, the attorney, myself, Al Daigle Jr. and Sr., and my Uncle André, who went and visited with the bishop. We tried to keep it open, and we were ultimately denied. But up until that point, when I look at the video, that was our life. Like they said, even back then, it was church and schools. I went to St. Joseph, L'école St. Joseph. I was in a French play in the 2nd grade. We did the anniversary of the church. Everybody came. Everything was at St. Joe's Hall. And then, of course, I went to the high school. We had réveillon, so my mother and my father, my mom would go to midnight mass, and then there was partying afterwards. That was a big treat. I sang in the French choir at Saint Jean-Baptiste, and like I said, I was on the parish council. So, I stayed till the end and watched it all go away. And then full circle, I ended up working at Coalition for a Better Acre when they purchased the elementary school and the high school. And my office was in the convent, looking out the window at the elementary school that I went to. And then ultimately watched as we renovated the high school. So, it's tough. It's there. Those buildings are still there. St. Joe's Hospital, where I was born, is still there, but it's not a hospital. The schools are not schools. And the church, Dave can speak to that, but it's still there, and maybe it will end up Kerouac Center, but it will never be what it was, which was the center of our lives and our existence. And it's just a reminder now how much more respectful we are today about neighborhoods and community than we were then. I think that's it. Yep. So.
Hello? Oh, there we go. Hi, everybody. I wasn't planning on speaking up here. I asked her, I said, how do I get a bottle of water? She says, only the people up there that speak get water, so I handed it up. Thank you. Where do I start? So I grew up in the Acre neighborhood also. As a matter of fact, I still live at 113 Cabot Street. Very interesting house. There's 6 fireplaces in there because it was built probably when Lincoln was president, so everything was heated by fireplace. I take apart the different things. I found the old brick oven where they made the bread, the old cooking oven, which they used to use. So there's a lot of interesting history inside those buildings. But also one of the things I noticed is that the closets are only this deep. You can't even put a hanger in there. And the reason is all the girls had robes. But there's hooks all the way around, even on the door, every which side of the closet, just so you can hang a robe. So, I did grow up in, over there. I went to St. Joe's Grammar School, High School, St. Jean the Baptist Church. You made me think when you said you were in a play. I was in a play at St. Joseph's Grammar also. I played a very important role. I was Toto in The Wizard of Oz. I had a lot of speaking parts. It was hard to remember. Then from there, also at the church, I was a choir boy and an altar boy. And I remember I loved to sing, but if you ask Mr. Srinath, the guy who did the directing it, you knew when I sang because he'd go like this, like me. He wanted the body, but he didn't want the voice completely. Especially midnight mass, he'd say, tone it down, Mr. Srinath. And I remember Mr. André Ouellette, he ran the organ back then. Remember? Choir boy singing St. Joe's Toto, I did that, I did that. On another note over here, the only, yeah. So going back to the beginning of the film, the guy in the red sweater, that's my father. That was my father, Butch, Paul Roger Ouellette. And then outside was Pete Cody, the Goof, that was the guy with the hat on, and then of course, your uncle was there. The Pastime Club has been a big part of my life with the thing too. It's my grandfather back in the 1960s, he was a president. Back in the 1980s, my father over the years was vice president a few times, and then I was president for 28 years. And a very good place. We've had a lot of fun over there over the years. We donate a lot to the community. We're part of a lot of stuff. The Pastime Club has a rich history. One of the things too is we have a few people that have kind of famous out of there. Like she said, Tiger Fréchette, the blonde tiger. He was one of the silver mittens, welterweight.
He was New England champion welterweight.
Welterweight, yes. One of the champions in Lowell. Also, we had Bob Tessier. He was a big part of our club. Whenever he'd come from Hollywood, he would just stop on in. He'd be there for hours just having a few drinks because that was his neighborhood. Matter of fact, we dedicated a plaque to him on the outside of the club. We had a big event on that one. And then my father also. My father was just a mild-mannered man, but he was the arm wrestling champ of Lowell, then of Massachusetts, then of New England, and then he went on to the wide world of sports and came in 12th in the world. And then I remember too, we'd be at the club and you could see like a big thing of bikers come up, where's this guy Butch? And it was interesting. My father would get on and boom. But anyways, it was interesting. And then my grandparents, right across the street pretty much from the row house I'm in, that's where they had a Ouellette's nickel lunch. And my grandfather won it in a card game at the Pastime Club. And that happened back then. So they had that for many years, and it was Ouellette's nickel lunch. Everything was a nickel, pork pie, beans, this thing, that thing. It was a thing, but they'd also help everybody in the neighborhood. If somebody was stuck, by the time they closed, they had a pile of IOUs like this, but it was just what you did. You remember all the stores too, the variety stores, they had the little sheet, yeah, and they just write it on it. I think that's about it. That's all the paper I had. So, thanks for the water. Thank you.
I got labeled as the academic, so I think that's trouble, but I'm going to try to not be an academic and just tell you what I know about the space. I didn't grow up in Lowell, but I've lived in Lowell for 25 years. I've taught history here for 30. I grew up in Beverly, which is not that far from here. And I lived for many, many years in Holyoke, which is mentioned in the documentary, and was very familiar with the French-Canadian community there. One part of my family came down from Quebec. I can always remember at Christmas time, one side of my family spoke French and the other Italian, and they would be talking about the presents in French and Italian, thinking we didn't know what they were saying, but we were smart enough to know when we heard a toy name. So that basically was how we got by. I've done a lot of work thinking about what happens to immigrant communities over time and how much of Lowell history has been basically knocked down over the years. There are several neighborhoods that have been pretty much obliterated as the city has gone in different directions, developed differently from the mills to other possibilities. And Little Canada, when it was taken down, was a real turning point, I think, in the city, in the sense that there were 3,000 or so people, several hundred businesses, all the cultural things that people have talked about on the panel as well as in the documentary, and that basically all got dispersed, and that got dispersed in a really rough way. And one of the things that I did a few years ago with my students is try to document what happened. And you may notice that over around the university there are several historical signs and markers that talk about the history of the neighborhood, and that was really a project that I did with several students to try to understand better and help them think about that physical space that the university inhabits now. A lot of that was where Little Canada was, where big big parts of it were. And so I want to read a little bit. Again, that's what academics do. This is a quote from the Lowell Sun in 1965. Waiting to move is like hell. You're told that eventually you must move, but they never tell you when. You see buildings torn down around you and the dust and dirt cover your house. Yet they never tell you when they're taking your land. I've been packing for 3 years. This is somebody describing what they're waiting for. And for those of you that lived in the space, you know this. For people who didn't, they basically, street by street, knocked the neighborhood down and then burned everything that they knocked down. So imagine that. You're a kid, you're living in this neighborhood that has all the joy that everybody before me has described from living in the area. And what you see is street by street, they're coming for you. Street by street, if this is where you live, this is where you've grown up, if this is what you know, somebody has made a decision. You don't completely understand who the people were that made the decision. You don't understand why they made the decision. They're telling you that your neighborhood is a blighted neighborhood. That's a word they use. They're telling you your neighborhood is no good. But it's what everybody said here just now and what people in that video lived in and described. That did not, I mean, that, the women singing around that table were people I would want to have a wine with. Or something else, I don't know, maybe a whiskey, whatever it would be. But that, I mean, but to sit there and watch as one street after another, and the documentary photos that exist are quite stunning. When you watch, they took big, heavy machinery and bashed it into a tenement block that people lived in, dumped it over and lit it on fire. That's America, 1964 and 1965. That's something that shouldn't be forgotten in the way that we think about and talk about immigrants, refugees, asylees. The people that lived in that space basically became nomads for a while. Where are we going to go? Some people, if they were fortunate, could find another place in Lowell, maybe in Pawtucketville upriver somewhere, where they were building some new houses. Other people dispersed, and so it was another dispersal, like the one that's described in the video of people leaving Quebec for various reasons back in the late 19th or the early 20th century. And so it's important to really try to keep that in mind and think about that history, which is why, like, documenting all of this with the signs became really important. The other thing that the city did when they knocked the neighborhood down, and I'll finish with this, they struggled politically to get the buy-in from the city to do it and get the votes on the city council to do it. And what they did is, in a very deliberate way, they dehumanized the space, because they didn't say they were renewing Little Canada, because that meant there were people there. They called it the Northern Canal Project. And so they rebranded the physical space that people had lived in for generations. And the signs and the photographs that you see, it's the Northern Canal Project. It's not we're tearing down a place where people lived and played music and raised a family. And so again, this is an important part of the story to really keep in mind and to try to understand. And again, this is not the only neighborhood it happened to in Lowell, but it was really probably the largest in terms of the physical space. But there was a big area of the Greek neighborhood. The same thing happened to a bit earlier in time, in the late 1930s, early 1940s. For those of you that live in Lowell, there was a neighborhood called Hale Howard, which is where the train station is now, which had been historically an old Jewish neighborhood. That got wiped off the map, and a historically black neighborhood over off Gorham Street was knocked down as well. A lot of this was done to make way for the Lowell Connector. And where Little Canada was, was supposed to be an industrial park. The vision, the plan for the city was you would clear this space and all the high-tech companies in greater Boston would move to Lowell because it would be cheaper to pay workers and you would find cheaper land where all of these families had lived. No industrial park came, obviously, and eventually the university spread out in the largely cleared space. But to dehumanize people in the way that it was done, and to right in front of people living in the neighborhood basically knock their places over and burn them down, is really, really something important, I think, for us to try to understand. We're a city that claims it loves its history, but we really violently destroyed a big piece of that, of that puzzle in the process. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all very much for those interventions. It was very interesting. Questions, comments? Yes.
Whose bright idea was
You
this?
have to use the microphone.
Whose bright idea was this with this urban renewal? Because where I grew up in and around Boston, I saw as a kid the West End go totally into the ground.
Yep.
And not only that, that Southwest Corridor project, they all failed. And it ended up just like this. But who thought of this and who sold it? You have to come in and sell this to people. What was going to be the payoff other than, you know, an industrial thing?
Well, I don't know if this is true because my involvement with Little Canada is only from after the war to about 1962, 63. But I always heard from my parents that they were being promised new housing. They're going to tear this all down, they're going to put up brand new, nice quality housing in its place, and the French Canadians would have a chance at it again, and the church would still be there, and the schools would still be there, and so there'd be a brand new French Canadian neighborhood. But I don't know if that's true at all. I did once go down to City Hall to ask the question. And this person looked at me and said, there was so much money available from the federal government to tear things down, we had to find some place to tear it down. And so it didn't matter where it was just they had tons of money coming from the federal government to take care of these blighted areas, which were in many ways a bit of a fire trap, I think. You know, these are wooden tenements, 3-4 stories high, which everybody I'm sure has seen how the mills caught on fire so fast. I mean, the mills were soaked in oil and grease, so most of them were burnt down. But these were places that were dangerous to upkeep, you know, not to fight for the side of the government, but I think that was the rationale. But we were told that, you know, we could move out for a while and eventually there'd be beautiful housing there. We could come back and restore the Little Canada. I'm sure nobody believed that the kids might not be married to other French Canadians by then.
The federal government definitely played a role. The federal government in the late 1930s started creating pockets of money that cities could get if they designate, and this became federal law, if they designated an area of a community that was, in the words of the legislation, blighted. They could get federal money to tear it down and then money to build new housing. So the Greek Acre over by the Greek church, that across from the Olympia, that became one of the first so-called urban renewal sites in the country. And Lowell right away applied for that money because it was also going to be used to put people to work. And so part of the initial plan did in fact come from the federal government. And the idea was kind of like a quid pro quo. You would get the money to tear stuff down, and then you would get money to build a new community around wherever it was that you tore the stuff down. By the 1950s, basically this became the way to so-called rebuilt cities. So this happens in Lawrence, it happens in Boston, as you say. Almost any mill city in New England has an urban renewal story of one kind or another that displaced an immigrant community. Little Canadas are all over New England, and they're essentially all knocked down. I mean, I've been working on a edited book with a bunch of people writing about Woonsocket, Rhode Island, and part of Providence, and a bunch of other places, and it's the same. It's basically the same story.
Thank you.
I don't know if I need a mic.
For the recording in a mic.
I have a quick question. Can you hear me?
What?
Yes. I never seen the mic I didn't like. We call it Cement City
Yeah.
after they tore down Little Canada. They built all of these, I call them housing projects, I guess. What was the intent of those buildings? It was never to relocate French Canadian people in there. What was the intent of those buildings? To do what? To move new people in? Or to change the dynamics of the whole city?
What I know.
If anybody knows.
What I know from working there is, the reality is, 'cause my family moved to the North Common Village, which actually was originally thought that the Greeks would move in there. Of course, they all dispersed and then we moved in. But with North Canal, and I'm sure Professor Forrant would say more, but you have to realize that you don't get an automatic pass into one of those units when they were built. It's still an application process. So the idea that people would wait 3, 4, 5 years or whatever and then move back in, it was ludicrous. They would have to go elsewhere. So it wasn't, I don't know that that was ever the intent, but we know for a fact that they weren't built well. The people that lived there lived in horrendous conditions. I have family members who lived in them. It was only when CBA got them for $1 in 1986 that they began to be renovated and be habitable. So they were poor quality, not nowhere you would want to live, and it was open pretty much to anybody really wanted to live there.
And one of the other things we just noticed the other day, it was very interesting, is St. Joe's High School. It's the grammar school. No, yeah, the grammar school on Moody Street. Yeah, right where the Northern Canal Apartments are. That's a 4-story building, and if you stand where you can see the Northern Canal Apartments 4-story building, there's like almost a 1.5 story difference between them, but they're both 4-story buildings. It's when they built that, when they built it like a garage, they just put the concrete walls, they put a concrete slab on top, and they put another 4 walls, another concrete slab on top, right up to the roof, as minimal as they could on that project. I feel tall because I can just about touch the ceiling in there.
Yeah.
And you can just see the difference though. Just, you gotta do that. Go up Moody Street and stand and look at both of them at the same time. It's mind-boggling how they can both be a 4-story building. And so, from what I understand too, they serve their purpose, they serve their life. They can't even renovate them now for like the price, so that I believe those over the next few years will be all renovated into new housing right there. Taken down and bit by piece, and everything's gonna be new.
I'll move off of urban renewal for a moment, although I think there's several good books in that topic. And it's religion. Both the film and your comments talked about the centrality of the church in life, but at least 2 of the songs seem to have a certain irreverence towards the church, which I don't have any problem with. But could you address, like, to synchronize because if those songs were from earlier generations just being handed down, was that the attitude kind of historically? And then how do you equate that with the importance of the church and the culture?
Oh, boy.
I'll answer that. Okay? I come from a family of 14. My parents were really, really good.
Introduce yourself. Who are you?
All right, I'm Ed Latenda. Okay, I used to live on Cabot Street. We we owned, my mother and father owned the last building on where the canal was, and there was 4th Street, and the next, and my father was Latenda Printing. Probably made every invitations, wedding invitations for everybody in Lowell. There were only 2 printers, Eno, who did the religious part of it, and my father. Now, talk about songs, they had to have fun, okay? And basically, they made what was called a little risque songs, and they came down from Canada. Some of these, I have some of those albums that are really risque, and they talk and they swear, but yet everyone enjoyed it. And you went to church on Saturday for confession, and then you went to church on Sunday for the Mass, okay? And nobody worked on Sunday. That was one of the things about Lowell and the French community. Talk to you about the renovations that they did, okay? I was there. Like, I left home in 1965, okay? So I seen my parents when they were basically evicted from their home in one of the row houses, okay, they were living in. Okay. And basically, they gave them a lousy $11,000 to go buy another house. That was the fee that they got. Okay. Now, true, if you shopped around back then, you could buy a house for around that vicinity. But you had to make your own way of moving and you know, transporting everything you had. Now, we weren't the only ones, everyone else, and you talked about the tenement houses. The tenement houses were right on the canal, 4 stories, 5 stories. Now, you're talking about families in there that basically had 5, 6, 7 kids, okay, and they lived in an apartment. In the row houses, we lived on a corner one. There was 11 of us basically at the end, okay? But there was 14 kids. I'm number 13. I'm the baby, okay? But 2 houses down from us, there was another family called Arel, and they had 19 kids. 18 girls, 1 boy. Oh. And 1 bathroom. Okay? But you never heard anyone complain, ever. You have 1 bathroom in a house now, you have 2 kids. And you hear everything for the next 8 hours. They couldn't get the bathroom fast enough in time. All right. Anybody else?
So, can I ask a question of the audience? Can I ask a question of the audience?
Well, no, wait, could we?
Oh, go there.
Paul
Okay.
wanted
Answer
to-
my question. And
Yeah, Paul was going to answer the question.
Oh, the risque music.
Yes. I also have a theory about this.
I'm not a musical historian, but knowing what I do know about the whole thing is most of these songs are really quite old. They're probably 200, 300, 400 years old. And they're coming from a time of Renaissance in Europe. And at that time, most of the songs were about making fun of the churches, intimacy, drinking, you know, as Eddie said, you know, people are having fun. And these are things that are fun. It's just the way it is. I mean, I know I've performed a lot of French songs over the years, and they're almost all about those 3 things. I can't think of anything else. You know,
Or all 3 in the same song, right?
Yeah, occasionally they're philosophical and filled with memories, like the one my mom sang in the documentary about Lac Saint-Jean, you know, yearning. That's it.
So I was talking to Paul before because, you know, the French attitude when we were growing up, there is that melding of the faith and church, and yet this risque, very accepting way of life. But I was telling him, I remember learning the song about the little fishermen on the boat and the little poisson, and then they ran out of food, and then they were pulling straws to see who they were going to eat. I was in like the first grade, and I was just like, luckily the poisson came, the fish, and the little boy, because he got the short straw, wasn't eaten for dinner, but it was like very devastating. You know the song I'm thinking about. But it was just, you know, the faith was always there, but there was you lived life. There was a lot more to it than that. But I do remember a lot of saying, what did he say? And we go, can't tell you, you know, because there's something as a small child you could hear.
And I don't want to belabor, but it wasn't so much the riskatiness of the songs, it was that the priests were the subject matter of the riskatiness of the songs.
Well, every family had a priest too, so let's be realistic. They probably know who they were.
And so, okay, so I'm from Quebec, and so my relationship to this comes from like a little bit of it bifurcated at some point, and my relationship is a little bit later in a way. But what my parents have always told me about these songs and this relationship to the church is the fact that, like, in Quebec, at least, it was very, very strict. They kind of like were the mayor of the town, and like, they knew everything that was going on, and like the priest was like the person in charge, and the person who controlled everything, and the person who was like the authority figure, and like the person who you kind of, you listen to. And so that, in that power dynamic, there was also a bit of a rebellious streak in the French Canadians, where as like a relief and to like live with this form of authority, they also made fun of the authority. And so that's why the jokes and the butt of the joke is often the priest himself, because he's like the authoritarian figure in the story that like people listen to and has a huge impact on people's lives, but that you kind of like want to rebel against a little bit and poke fun at. And so it's poking fun at power also, I think, in those songs.
Mercedes. Oh, this is
And I think it shows that all through the history of the church, unfortunately, there has always been an undercurrent of the bad apples being in a position where they can take advantage of the power that they have over the people. Like the song about the priest giving his penance to the young girls just indicates that sexual abuse was always there. And what's amazing is that the people knew it, were not necessarily in a position to do anything about it. Now, I think all of us who, you know, still have respect and practice our faith, you know, like have known holy people. You can't continue believing unless you have met, I feel, people that you look at and say they are living what they preach. But there are always the ones who are in their position, perhaps for other reasons, or who have been corrupted by their power. And I think the songs are remarkable in that a reality is being talked about openly in the song that was kind of kept under the covers, you know, like in other ways. So it's really a revelation, you know, that the people amongst themselves dared to sing about something that certainly somebody they knew had encountered. And yet, look at the people singing the song, like your family. I mean, you look at the ladies in that family and they're all talking about going to church. So the faith survived in spite of the dark underside, you know? And that's life. That's my opinion anyway. My hypothesis.
My name is Richard Talbot, and I was born and raised in Lowell, Massachusetts, and a lot of my heritage comes from Little Canada. Thank you for what you just said for me, because that certainly adds a lot of perspective, I think, for me to understand that. I thought that, I can only speak for myself, but that was very good for me to hear. I'm raised in the Catholic Church myself. On a lighter note, let's talk about something that has to do with, because if you're going to talk about music, you've got to talk about food. And my meme and my mother used to make some really good different things.
Jamaica.
Oh, sorry about that. So talking about food is really important because I have so many memories of different things, treats, as well as stuff that was, you know, and I don't know if it's, we can quickly do that, but can you give me some of your memories of some of your stuff?
Well, if it's food, I'm going to start with farm-made candy in the center of Little Canada. I mean, what's it like to live in a ghetto that has a candy factory in the middle? It was superb. Every time we would go to the aunts and uncles, there were trays and trays of candy from farm-made candy. And with the seasons, was a different candy all the time. It was great.
Fanny Farmer.
Oh, no, it's farm-made. Farm-made is what it was called, yeah. And so I start with that, but yeah, on Chiva Street, exactly. Since you mentioned Chiva Street, I think it was only 1 block away from the horse livery. Do you remember that? There was a horse livery 1 block away, and you could smell the beautiful chocolate smell here and the manure here at the same time. And sometimes they mixed really uniquely. Yeah. They were right next door. That's my...
That sounds like Mackinac Island, by the way. It's the horse and the chocolates everywhere. We did a lot of, typical French Canadian food and a lot of beans, and I learned that I don't like a lot of that. My mom was convinced I didn't eat anything until I discovered Greek food and all of the other foods in Lowell. But mostly, we always had a formal dinner on Sunday. We ate dinner together. We had a strict rule, no TV ever. While you ate dinner, we ate together, and whatever was in front of us, we were expected to eat. But like I said, a lot of bean suppers, and Cody's beans, and whatever was there. Salmon pie is still a personal favorite of mine. But yeah, so, and I don't remember the chocolate. I wish I did.
I remember one of the biggest times for food was right after midnight mass. It was like one of the biggest days of the year. All the women would take off for mass, and the guys had to cook. And so a lot of them stayed behind, and you had a couple of extra shots, you got a couple of extra beers, and when everybody come back from midnight mass, you were up till 3, 4 in the morning that night, and every bit of food that you can think of was there. Pork pies, salmon pies, the beans, the French chop suey, it was everything. Remember that one? Yes. And then we're only one of them that we call a meal like pork scrap. Good though. But it's still written down as pork scrap too. As a matter of fact, I got some at my house from Cody's this weekend. I still love this stuff. But yeah, that was one of the biggest memories of food was midnight mass.
Fréchette's beans?
Yes.
Oh, we were Cody's beans.
Yes.
When I moved to Lowell, my neighbor said, you have to go to Vic's and get French Canadian meat pies and pork pies and salmon pies. And they told me for a French Canadian meat pie, you have to put really, really sharp cheddar cheese on it when you heat it. And so I got like a whole description, and then I learned about Cody's, which I didn't know until I've been here a little while. And they said, oh, you have to go there. So I had pork scraps, but I didn't work for me. But I was really disappointed when Vic's closed, because that was like one of my go-to places in Lowell for food. My question was, just we can do it quick by like a show of hands. I've been told by so many people that all of the 3 and 4 story apartments along the canalways, that teenagers dove off the roof of those into the canals.
Oh, yeah.
So is that true, or is that bull crap?
It's true.
We have some divers up there? Yeah, it's true? Okay. I repeat the story because I love it, but I just couldn't completely get my brain around. But it's true. Definitely true? Okay, very good.
In the snow piles in the winter.
Now as a historian, I can actually footnote it. Okay, good.
Thanks, Mercedes, yeah.
And another one was they would jump off from the snow piles in the winter, the same tenements. Right from the porch.
Oh, get a question here before we wrap up. First, I want to say, this, Mercedes, your panel's been a really wonderful time here. It's been very moving just to see my ancestry is British and I live in Nashua, but to see the film and hear what's been shared here has been it's been a very moving 2 hours. My name's Steve with John and Suzanne. We're on the committee that puts on the Kerouac Festival here every fall, which gets me to the question I have. One of my major knowledge or understanding of the French-Canadian Franco-American presence in Lowell has been through Kerouac's 5 Lowell-based novels that he writes about growing up here in the 1920s and 30s. And he never lived in Little Canada. His family, they sort of moved back and forth between Pawtucketville and Centerville. And so it gets me to the question, just kind of a matter of curiosity. How much of a concentration of French-Canadian Franco-American concentration was there in the Centerville and Pawtucketville communities as, say, compared to Little Canada? I've always been a little curious about that.
So, a lot, shall we say. So I had a lot of family in Centerville and Pawtucketville. So I think when people felt more prosperous is when they moved. So my partner came from Centerville on Fisher. Yeah, Fisher, I'm saying it right. His whole family lived in Centerville, and they're French-Canadian. They went to Saint-Louis de France. So then, or he went to Pawtucketville, where some of my Pepe siblings moved, and they went to Saint-Jean-d'Arc. But I did want to add, my one claim to fame with Kerouac is when his funeral, my mom dragged me to the funeral, and we stood outside, and I whined incessantly about why was I there, and she's in one of the videos. But, mysteriously, I am not. So I suspect my mom was not keeping an eye on me at that very moment. But I remember standing there, and they brought the casket out of Saint Jean-Baptiste and the whole thing. And it was because in her mind, this was someone that was important to her culture, and we needed to reflect the moment of his funeral.
Quick thing on that. I think it strikes me about that picture of his casket being carried out in the church. You've got, 8 pallbearers?
We had 8 pallbearers, and 7 of them were Lowell people dressed in their coats and ties and their shirts. And then you got Allen Ginsberg in the middle of it. He's bald head and big hair. And I just thought that was so, that's the most enduring image I have of him being, his casket being carried out of St. John Baptiste with these very proper Lowellians, and they put Allen Ginsberg in the mix there. I always got a kick out of that.
So I said, we talk about the priests, but we also have to talk about the sisters. And I never was so intimidated by Sister Priscilla. Oh my gosh. And so I think they knew this. So like every, at the beginning of each board meeting, they would say, okay, so Pat, you look up, you have to say a prayer. So I'd be on my phone, so oh gosh, I have to say a prayer for teachers. And then at the end, they said, oh, no, you have to say a prayer for students. So I'd be looking at my phone for my prayer for students. But anyways, but what I found real loss, I think Saint-Jean-d'Arc when it closed, especially academically, the kids were brilliant. And when they scored in diocese, it was always about Saint-Jean-d'Arc. But I noticed the change in demographics, and I think one of the reasons a lot of the Catholic schools were closing was because it was just that dip in demographics, and you could see, the kids who were going there were definitely the demographics of kids who are now in Lowell. But, so they had a hard time just finding, kids to go to the schools. So when you think about your children or your grandchildren as speaking French, so when was that lost, or why? Even you see it in the film, she's saying, oh, my kids don't want to speak French, they don't want. What happened there? Was it just a question of being just so American and not, learning French, or just stubbornness of being a youth? But, because I see that, Bob, you've done quite a bit on the Greek population, and I know there was a great Greek exhibit here, there was one for the Portuguese, but I was waiting for the French Canadians to do something like this and to continue on. But why do you think the generations just have not picked up?
I think it was the laziness of the parents to teach the kids. Absolutely, I'm getting blamed by my kids right now. Why didn't you teach us French? Well, you're so busy, you got 4 kids, and not 18 or 19, but 4. And you're running around, and it's bad enough to keep them speaking the proper English. So I think it was the laziness of the parents. That's just my opinion.
No.
Okay.
How about being brought to Canada by your grandmother, and she says to you, they don't speak your language. Arrangez-vous, amusez-vous. That's how you kept it. That's how I kept it. It gave me a kick in the right place.
What I remember distinctly, I was a young teenager at the time, but in the late 50s, early 60s, that we heard, at least I remember hearing it, I'm not telling you it's correct, the parents were saying, we've got to get these kids to be focused in English because this is how they get a job. Right. Okay, we can't have them going into these places like AFCO Space Systems was moving into Lowell. You can't have French-Canadian talk at AFCO Space Systems. Somehow it doesn't make much sense. So I remember the adults talking about switching over. For what it's worth, I'll just drop this idea. About at the same time, Canada was going through what is called the Quiet Revolution, which if you're interested in history, take a look at what that was all about. But in little Canada, they were saying, if you want a good job, if you want to go to college, if you want to get by in life, you're going to have to speak good English. And so we're not interested in making you speak French. It's different than now encouraging your kids to speak French, and they can learn it on their own with Duolingo. You know, but in those days, this is what I remember.
And I remember I was raised by my grandparents, so they always talked French, and so I could understand all the conversations they had. Went to St. Joe's. But then even my grandparents, after quite a while, when she was talking with her sister, and a lot of years old, you speak 90% English, 90% French, few words of English get thrown in, and eventually the conversation is it just keeps going a little bit more English. Then when they reach my father's level, like you see when he was talking to everybody, he talked French, but they go back and forth even at the club. It'd be talking English, it'd be talking French, and then I'm third generation. If you put a paper in front of me, I could still read it, get the gist of it. If you were talking, I could pick out the things. But where I'm third generation, it's, everything I've been involved in is all English speaking around me. So it just goes over the years, but I think that's most nationalities too. You start off and it just gets lost over many centuries. Now my three boys, they don't speak French at all. They're all married and they have their children, and it's all English now.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. In 1904, my mother was born, first of 11 children. And she was never allowed to speak French because her parents, both born in Canada, both immigrated to the States, realized that if they raised their children that weren't if they raised them without an accent, they could speak good English, they would probably be able to keep them out of working in the mills for the rest of their life. So for them, it was an economic choice, so their children would not have to struggle as hard as they did. So my mother, who spoke perfect English, her cousins came from Canada every summer, and she made them talk to her in French so she could practice. The tears will almost come. I watched my mother as a young woman, and I'm a young child. If she ever had the opportunity to speak in French with anybody, she became the most alive human being that I had ever had around me, versus the only English-speaking mother who was kind of flat. So you can see what our society has done in a country that still fights against English only and takes away from all of us this incredible ability to speak in multiple languages. And right now we're struggling with that even more, so let's all stand up for knowing as many languages as we can, especially our French-Canadian heritage.
Thank you. This is a great note to end on, I think. Thank you all so much to our panelists, and thank you everybody who attended and came. It was I'm very grateful for everybody's attention and for everybody's interest in this, and I hope that we can host several more of these kinds of dialogues in the future. I'd like to invite you to move to O'Leary 510, so on the 5th floor in the World Languages and Cultures Department. There's food and beverages, and we can continue the conversation in a more informal kind of setting. and we will usher you there to make sure that nobody gets lost in this labyrinth of a building. And thank you all again so much.